They say silence is golden, but I have learned that in the wrong house it's a muzzle. My silence lived in the corners of the walls, thick like dust, dense with years of knowing but not speaking. I sat in that silence on a beige recliner that was not mine, surrounded by family pictures I did not choose my name, uttered mostly when bills came in, or when something needed fixing in the past tense. Mom used to handle that. Grandma always knew where the papers were. 2 years ago, my body betrayed me. A stroke not large enough to take me, but precise enough to slow me to quiet my once sharp tongue and make my hand tremble when I held a spoon. After the hospital, I was told I'd come live with my daughter and her husband in their suburban New Jersey home, a neat house with siding that looked like it had never been touched by time or trouble. It promised safety. I had nodded, grateful then. Now I wonder if the nod was the first brick laid on a path to disappearance. I wasn't dying. I wasn't helpless. But in that house I was invisible in a new way. It started small. My name was taken off the account for my own pension check for simplicity, my daughter said. My Medicare correspondence was rerouted to her email. My prescription deliveries were redirected, and she administered the pills with a sweetness that soured once she left the room. I tried to speak up once about a charge I noticed, a $500 withdrawal I hadn't made. She smiled in that tight way of hers and said, "Don't worry, Mom, it was for groceries. You eat, don't you?" Her husband chuckled behind her like a silent dog agreeing with its master. I did eat. I sat at their polished mahogany table each evening, a guest in a home I partially funded with a lifetime of work. They never asked what I wanted for dinner. They never noticed that I stopped drinking tea, that the chamomile she brewed sat untouched. My grandson, Jeremy, would come by sometimes, his face awash of flickering screens and distant music. He never looked up for long. I remembered when I used to tuck him into bed humming old lullabies while tracing invisible circles on his back. Now, I wasn't sure he remembered my name without someone prompting him, but the worst part wasn't what they did. It was how easily I let them. I shrunk into myself like fabric forgotten in a washing machine, once bold, now limp. I told myself this was the price of being cared for. I told myself love sometimes looks like control when it's tired, but deep down I knew. This wasn't love, it was comfort at my expense. It wasn't until a Tuesday morning in early spring, one of those days when winter's breath still kissed your ankles, that something inside me began to rustle. I had found a letter shoved in the junk drawer while looking for my old spectacles, a bank statement. I hadn't seen one in over a year. I wasn't supposed to. That drawer, they assumed, was beyond my reach, but my fingers, clumsy and arthritic, proved otherwise. There, in black and white, multiple purchases from stores I'd never stepped foot in. Electronics clothing in sizes that wouldn't fit my bones. And then a charge from a day spa. My heart thudded in my chest, not from betrayal that I had grown used to, but from the spark of indignation. My money, my life. That night at dinner, I watched her serve lasagna and speak in that chirpy voice that people use for customer service. I studied the rhythm of her lies, the way she controlled the table's air like a ventriloquist. And I truly knew, I had been lulled into a cage padded with politeness and phrases like, "We're just trying to help and you're not as sharp as you used to be." I couldn't leave right then. My legs wouldn't allow it, and I had no plan. But the seed had been planted. A truth had surfaced, undeniable and hot. They weren't saving me. They were siphoning me. Not just my money, but my presence, my voice, my memory of who I used to be. The next day I asked for a copy of my financial records. My daughter laughed, assuming I was confused again. I didn't push, not yet. I just smiled and nodded the way I always had. But inside a new voice had begun to speak, not loudly, not yet, but steady like the tick of a clock, reclaiming lost time. In the days that followed, I began to move differently, not physically, but inside, like a hand had reached into the wet cement of my soul before it hardened and reshaped something. I wasn't confrontational. That's never been my way. I'm the type who folds napkins even when alone, who answers anger with silence, who believes in the power of waiting. But waiting is not the same as surrender. And I'd mistaken one for the other for far too long. I started observing more carefully. When my daughter left her laptop open one evening to take a phone call, I walked over. Not quickly, I knew better than to show haste, but with measured, aged precision. I clicked open the browser. Her bank account was still logged in. My name was there, my money was there, but none of the decisions were mine. It wasn't just a matter of groceries or essentials. She'd used my savings to upgrade the kitchen, to pay for Jeremy's summer soccer league, to buy new curtains I'd never touched. I closed the laptop gently, like returning a book to a library shelf. That night I didn't sleep. Not from anger, but from shame, the kind that creeps up when you realize you've been complicit in your own erasure. The following morning I called Evelyn. We hadn't spoken in months. Evelyn was my sister-in-law, a spitfire from Queens, with a voice like gravel and the soul of a lioness, my late husband's younger sister. We'd once been close, sharing tears and pie recipes and political rants. Time and life had pulled us apart, but I knew she'd pick up. And she did. I didn't tell her everything, not yet. I just said, "Evie, I need help. Not the kind that comes with casseroles, the kind that comes with clear eyes." And God bless her, she didn't ask questions. She just said, "Tell me when and where." It was that call that began my quiet campaign, the reclamation of self as I would come to think of it. I started by retrieving documents. Slowly, a bank statement left on the printer, a social security form in the mail. I asked my grandson to show me how to use my phone for online banking, playing the role of the forgetful grandma who just wanted to learn. Jeremy showed me, not out of love, but out of boredom. Still, the knowledge was mine now. I went to the local library under the guise of borrowing books. There, I used the computer to print out forms. I called a lawyer listed on a flyer taped to the library bulletin board. He specialized in elder financial abuse. I whispered the words into the receiver, barely able to say them aloud. Elder abuse. The syllables felt foreign, heavy, like picking up a word soaked in oil. But the lawyer, Mr. Castellano, didn't flinch. He spoke with gentle clarity, asked if I had access to my own identification. I did, tucked behind a faded photo of my husband in my old wallet. He asked if I could meet in person. I said yes. He offered to come to me. I said no. If I was going to take back my life, I needed to walk into it on my own legs, however wobbly. I began asking questions at home. When is my next doctor's appointment? Who ordered this prescription? Each time my daughter would tilt her head like I was slipping into senility. "Why don't you let me handle that, Mom?" she'd say, patting my hand. It wasn't the words, it was the weight behind them, the assumption that I was no longer the author of my own life. I didn't push back yet, but I stopped letting her close the door behind me. I began leaving it cracked figuratively and literally, so I could see out, so I could breathe. One night I asked Jeremy if he remembered the stories I used to tell him about my childhood in South Carolina, the way the river behind our house glowed at sunset like a ribbon of fire. He didn't. He shrugged. "We've got Netflix, Grandma." That stung more than I expected. Not because he forgot, but because I had forgotten too until that moment that I'd ever lived near a river. That I was once the girl who climbed trees barefoot and spit watermelon seeds into the sky. The next day I bought a small journal from the pharmacy. I began writing, not just names and dates and suspicious transactions, but stories, memories, truths I didn't want to lose again. When I met Mr. Castellano the following week at a neutral cafe in town, I handed him a folder. Inside were statements, notes, timelines. He leafed through it, impressed. "You've done your homework," he said. "No," I replied. "I'm just learning again how to speak my name." And that more than anything felt like victory. I don't think people understand how loud silence can be until it's broken, not by sound, but by clarity. Once I began to see the pattern, it was everywhere. In the way my daughter's voice tightened when I asked for unnecessary details. In the glances she exchanged with her husband when I tried to participate in decisions about the house. In how easily they'd rewritten the narrative of our lives, turning my stroke into a permanent weakness, my needs into burdens, and my savings into communal property. But there's something about truth, once you acknowledge it, it refuses to be unseen. I began withdrawing small amounts of cash from the account each week. Just 100 here, 50 there, enough to go unnoticed. I stored the bills in an old cookie tin I'd hidden beneath the towels in the back closet, the same place I used to hide Christmas gifts from my children decades ago. There was a kind of poetry in that. Each time I added to the tin, I felt a flicker of who I used to be, resourceful, steady, quietly brave. The woman who once helped my husband run a small hardware store and managed our books with a ledger and a pencil. Who raised 3 children through layoffs, illness, and grief without ever once asking for pity. I hadn't disappeared, I'd just been buried beneath layers of "for your own good." One Thursday afternoon, I took the bus alone the first time since the stroke. It wasn't easy. My legs ached. My balance swayed with each turn in the road. But I held on to the pole, eyes steady on the horizon. I visited a local credit union, opened a separate account in my name. I deposited the contents of my tin, and for the first time in years I felt rich. Not in money, but in control. Back at home, I kept up the performance, smiled when spoken to, took my pills, complimented the dinner I hadn't asked for. But each night I wrote in my journal. I wrote everything what they said, how they looked at me, the things they didn't know I saw, like the Amazon packages addressed to my daughter using my credit card, or the spa appointment confirmations that pinged her phone when she thought I was asleep. I told Evelyn everything. She was furious, of course, but also fiercely protective. She helped me draft a new will notarized by her neighbor. We set up legal documents with Mr. Castellano, powers of attorney revoked, account access revised. All done quietly, all above board. And still I said nothing to my daughter. Not yet. One Sunday morning we were sitting in the living room. The light slanted through the blinds, just so, falling across the carpet like bars of pale gold. My daughter was scrolling through her phone, her husband reading the sports section. Jeremy was upstairs gaming, I assumed. I was knitting or pretending to. The air was thick with familiarity, routine, and the unspoken hierarchy of the house. She said, "Mom, I was thinking maybe we could redo the upstairs bathroom next. The equity in the house has gone up, and it just makes sense to invest now." She didn't look up. She didn't need to. She assumed I'd agree. After all, hadn't I always? I set the yarn down. "That's fine," I said, steady. "Just make sure you don't plan to use any more of my money." The silence that followed was dense and immediate. Her head snapped up. "What?" I said. I repeated, my voice firmer than it had been in months. "Don't use my money. I've moved it." Her mouth opened, then closed. Her husband lowered the paper, his brows drawn. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice carrying that razor-sharp tone of a mother whose toddler has just said something precocious but troubling. "I mean exactly that," I replied. "I've taken back control of my finances, legally, permanently." I expected rage, denial, accusation. What I got was a kind of stunned disbelief laced with a forced chuckle. "Mom, you're confused. You've had a lot on your plate. We've been managing everything to help you." "And you helped yourselves to more than I ever agreed to," I said. "But it's done. And if you have questions, you can speak to my attorney." Her husband sat forward. "Are you threatening us?" I looked at him, really looked. A man who had lived in comfort built on the shoulders of someone else's sacrifice. "No," I said. "I'm setting a boundary. There's a difference." They both stared, unsure of who I had become, or rather who I had always been, now finally unearthed. I stood up slowly. My knees protested. My cane wobbled. But I did not. "I'll be moving out by the end of the month. I've found a place. Small, but mine." Their silence no longer frightened me. It freed me. I went upstairs, then, heart pounding but unshaken. I sat on the edge of the bed that never felt like mine and exhaled. I had broken the silence. Now I was ready to live in the sound of my own life again. The apartment I moved into wasn't grand. A modest one-bedroom on the edge of town, nestled between a small park and a strip mall with a nail salon and a discount grocery. The building had rust on its railings and a rickety elevator that sighed with age, much like me, but it was mine. The lease had my name on it, and when I turned the key in the lock for the first time, I felt something shift in my spine, a straightening like my bones were remembering how to carry the weight of freedom. The first few nights were quiet, almost too quiet. I found myself listening for footsteps in the hall, the thump of my grandson's music through the wall, my daughter's voice calling out my name with that honeyed tone that used to make my stomach clench. But all I heard was the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the radiator, the life of a place that had no expectations of me. I was alone, but not abandoned. And that was new. Evelyn visited that weekend, bringing a homemade peach cobbler and a bottle of wine she insisted we split. We sat at my small kitchen table, the afternoon sun turning everything to gold. "You sure about this?" she asked, spoon in hand, her sharp eyes watching me carefully. I nodded. I've never been more sure of anything. She leaned back satisfied. Good, because you were starting to fade into wallpaper back there. I laughed, truly laughed, and the sound surprised me. It had been a long time. The days fell into a rhythm. I joined a community center a few blocks away where I attended chair yoga and a memoir writing group. I met a retired nurse named Donna who had once traveled the country in a camper van and wore silver bangles up both arms. She was loud, unfiltered, and utterly refreshing. She invited me to lunch one day, and I found myself saying yes without hesitation, another small miracle. My lawyer, Mr. Castellano, kept things tidy. The paperwork was finalized, my new accounts secure. My daughter had sent one message after I left a long text teetering between guilt and veiled bitterness, ending with, "I just wish you'd talk to me." I didn't reply. What could I say that wouldn't be diluted by years of unheard truths? Instead, I wrote. Every morning before breakfast, I sat by the window and added to the journal I'd started in that silent house. I wrote about my childhood in the South, the way my father smelled of tobacco and river mud, the lull of cicadas in July, the first boy who kissed me behind the church. I wrote about my husband, his thick hands and warm silence, his sudden death from a heart attack that left me breathless in more ways than one. I wrote about motherhood, the beauty and the loss. The way I had poured myself into my children, never once imagining they might one day look at me and see a resource instead of a person. It hurt writing it all. But it was healing, too. Like pressing a warm cloth to a bruise. Sometimes I cried, but more often I smiled, because each word was a brick in a new foundation. There were moments of doubt, of course. Late at night, when the shadows lengthened and the walls seemed too quiet, I wondered if I had been too harsh, if maybe I had misunderstood their intentions. But then I'd remember the way they had spoken for me, over me, about me, as if I were a child or worse, a burden wrapped in skin and frailty. And I'd feel the steel return to my spine. One afternoon, Jeremy came to visit, unannounced. He looked taller, older, more tired than I remembered. He stood awkwardly in my doorway, shifting from foot to foot. "Mom said you moved here. I wanted to see if you were okay." I offered him a seat and poured him a glass of lemonade. We sat in silence for a few minutes. Then he said, "I didn't know. About the money, about all of it." I believed him. Children, even teenage ones, see only the world they're shown. I placed a hand on his. "It's not about the money," I said. "It's about remembering that I still matter, that I have a right to my own life." He nodded slowly. "I get it, kinda." That was enough. When he left, he hugged me, tentative but real, and I stood in the doorway long after he'd gone, the sun setting behind the buildings, casting long shadows on the floor. Not of loss, but of release. I wasn't bitter, I wasn't angry, I was becoming. Each morning now, I rise with a purpose. I make my coffee exactly the way I like it. I read the paper cover to cover. I tend to the potted fern Evelyn gave me, and I write, not for anyone else, just for me. My life reclaimed one page at a time. The seasons changed around me like a quiet procession. Summer softened into fall, and the leaves outside my apartment window turned the color of old copper and fire. With each passing week, I found myself leaning more into the quiet, not as an echo of loneliness, but as a companion I had long forgotten to cherish. I attended a storytelling event at the community center one evening, hosted in a circle of folding chairs and warm light. When it was my turn to speak, I read one of the stories I had written about the night I met my husband in a smoky church basement during a community potluck. I expected polite claps. Instead, the room went still, reverent. Afterward, a woman with soft gray curls and a tremor in her voice touched my arm and said I felt that in my chest. That night, walking home with the crisp air nipping at my cheeks, I realized something I had spent so much of my life being useful, dependable, the backbone of someone else's needs. I had forgotten what it felt like to simply be heard. Back in the apartment, I added a new entry to my journal. I am not just someone's mother, wife, or patient. I am a whole story still being written. One morning in November, I received a letter from my daughter. Not a text, not a voicemail, a letter. The handwriting was hurried but familiar, a little slanted to the right, like mine used to be before the tremors. It was 3 pages long. She said she had felt hurt, betrayed, even embarrassed by what I'd done. That she and her husband had only ever tried to take care of me. But then she wrote something that stopped me. Maybe we didn't realize how easily care becomes control, and how silence isn't always consent. She said she was in therapy now, that she had been asked for the first time to talk about her own upbringing, about how often I'd sacrificed without complaint, how she'd learned to take that as a given. I'm sorry, Mom, for forgetting that you're still here, still you. I read it 3 times, folded it, tucked it into the back of my journal. I didn't cry, not because it didn't matter, but because I was learning how to hold things without breaking under their weight. In December, Evelyn and I took a bus to Atlantic City. She said we were going to gamble away our guilt. I only played the penny slots, but I laughed until my ribs ached. We drank watered-down cocktails and watched the ocean from our hotel balcony. Somewhere between the neon lights and the tide, I remembered what it was like to feel wild, even if only for a moment. And that was enough. My home grew cozier with time. I added a second-hand armchair near the window where I'd sit with a blanket and a book. Donna brought over a small Christmas tree, and we decorated it with crocheted stars and old buttons. She called it Granny Chic. I called it Freedom in Pine Scent. Sometimes I still hear from Jeremy. He texts me photos, his new haircut, his latest art project, a dog he wants to adopt. He signs his messages, "Love you, G." I respond with care, but also boundaries. I don't want to be a myth for him, just a person who lived, learned, and changed. In late winter, I attended a support group for seniors who had experienced financial exploitation. I sat in that circle of quietly weathered faces, and I told my story, not with shame, with resolve. One woman, her eyes clouded with regret, said, "I didn't know you could take your life back." And I said, "It's never too late to stop giving away what you never meant to." Now, every Sunday, I make myself pancakes from scratch, even if they turn out lumpy. I put on jazz, open the window, no matter how cold, and let the music swirl through the room like a blessing. I talk to my husband's photo on the dresser. I tell him about the people I meet, the stories I write, the woman I'm becoming. I don't need permission anymore. I don't need approval. I have breath in my lungs, stories in my bones, and a bank account that answers only to me. For the first time in years, I am not surviving someone else's idea of love. I am living fully, quietly, powerfully on my own terms.